All right, class. I wanted to give a little more of an introduction to this literature review that's due this week. As you finish up on your literature review, I wanted to remind you of some important aspects of the literature review. And so hopefully you're well on your way to having changed that literature review according to the feedback that I've given you on your preliminary literature review. And now you are finishing it up. So I wanted to remind you about some of the more important aspects of this to look at before you submit this assignment. And one thing I wanted to mention is in a literature review, there is no I, we, or me. You don't use a personal pronoun like that. In other words, you don't say I am looking up these articles, or I found this article, or I am doing this kind of work. Instead, you talk about the articles themselves. Smith found this in his article, and this compares to Johnson's finding in this article. See, notice the difference there? You're not using your own name or not referring to yourself in a literature review. So don't refer to yourself in your literature review. Don't use I, we, or me in your literature review. It's supposed to be a more objective assessment of the situation. Also remember, there are some things that need to be in a literature review. It needs to be pretty well comprehensive. I require 15 sources of information or more. So it does need to cover the area of what you're reviewing. It needs to be organized so that the references that are least related to the problem are discussed first, and the most related references are discussed last. So that's important. It also needs to be more than just a series of abstracts or annotations. Like it can't just list one study and then tell what that study said, and then list the next study and tell what that next study said. Instead, it analyzes and critiques the various studies. You know, you're going to talk about, Smith found this in his study of 50 kindergartners, but that contrasts with the finding of Johnson in his study of younger students or something like that. Although how can you get younger than kindergarten? So remember that too. The review compares and contrasts the results of various studies listed. It includes mostly primary sources of information. So remember, the sources that you find for your literature review should be mostly the ones that are an actual research study that is being reported on, not a list of studies and a review of studies, because that's already a literature review. So what's the point of you taking a literature review and making another one out of it? So you need to find mostly primary sources of information. It should include only references that are relevant to your research study and an original summary and interpretation of the literature. Instead of just putting what other people said, you need to kind of conclude with some of your own findings, saying, in summary, project-based learning is this, this, and this based on the research that I've reviewed. It's your own conclusion comes at the end of the literature review, your own interpretation of some of the literature review. And then make sure, of course, that the references are cited completely and accurately. So let's take a look. You have been asked to look at these items, general class items, sample papers, and you can look at some of these research articles and see how they review literature. So the world is no longer flat to me. Let's see. And there's an introduction. And then this is a literature review as we get started, qualitative analysis of essays and so forth. So look at how this is written first. Let's look at this part here. In the early 2000s, a group of educators across disciplines worked to define possible characteristics of strong teaching and learning environments. So notice this is not saying, I looked up some information and found that this is interesting information. No, this is what a group of educators found. She's citing some important articles. Threshold concepts are transformative, irreversible, integrating, bounded, and can be counterintuitive. So again, you don't see the use of I or me or we. Instead, you see information that has been read in another source and put into here and cited with a citation. And so that's an example of a literature review. And it talks about how it organizes the literature review, what makes a concept a threshold concept. There's an introduction that introduces this idea, and that's part of the literature review somewhat. And then it also reviews qualitative analysis of reflective essays in world regional geography. And so it finds studies that are in that as well. and talks about how those things, what they've found basically in that area. Let's see, meta-analysis of death and dying. Let's have a look at this one. So we can find the literature review on this one. This one's longer. It looks like it's a research study or a dissertation study. So the abstract doesn't count. We want to get to chapter 1, and we want to, actually chapter 2 probably is where we want to be for a dissertation format. Be on chapter 2 is the literature review. So here we go, review of literature. Introduction. And again, remember, it doesn't say anything like, I found these great sources on terminally ill patients. No, it says as worldwide populations are aging, and it takes something from what they found and mentions it here and gives us sort of an overview of what they've found. And this is how to cite an article too. You can put Sharma, Monson, and Gary, 1996, reported that students who entered nursing usually bring with them various background experiences with death and dying. So that's a study, or a finding from the study. Sharma, Monson, and Gary, and that'll be cited below. They are expected to become accustomed to terminal illness and the process of dying. And then they talk about how different elements of the literature review come together, and then they have different areas of literature review that they title. Your literature review doesn't have to have different sections. It can just be one section, but it does need to have those 15 or more sources of information. So take a look at these under general class items. This is under content. In general class items, you can look at sample papers and you can see what kinds of reviews of literature that they have in them and try to follow that same type of narrative format and make sure that your review has all the characteristics that I mentioned earlier.